Morning after my wife was buried, I learned how quickly a life can be erased. I didn't learn it from grief, or from the empty side of the bed, or from the smell of flowers already beginning to rot. I learned it standing on my own front porch, key in my hand, realizing the house had decided I no longer belonged there. The silence that greeted me wasn't peaceful. It wasn't gentle. It pressed against my ears like a warning, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood on the porch with a small cardboard box in my hands. Inside it were sympathy cards, unopened mail, and the folded program from my wife's funeral. White lilies were still printed on the front. The ink hadn't even begun to fade. The flowers from yesterday were probably still inside. Or at least they should have been. I set the box down and reached for my keys. The keys slid into the lock easily. Too easily. Then it stopped. It didn't turn. I tried again. Same result. I pulled the key out and stared at it like it had betrayed me. Same grooves. Same scratches from years of use. This key had opened this door thousands of times. Late nights, early mornings, holidays, arguments, reconciliations. I tried the deadbolt. Nothing. That was when I noticed it. The faint scrape marks around the lock. Fresh metal against old paint. Someone had changed it. For a moment, my brain refused to process the thought. Grief does that. It slows everything down. Wraps reality in cotton so sharp truths don't cut all at once. Then I heard movement inside the house. Footsteps. Measured. Confident. The door opened just enough for the chain to catch. And there he was. My Stepson. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sad. He looked prepared, like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head and finally reached the part where he gets to speak. "Hey," he said flatly. I waited. Something in me still believed this was a mistake. That he'd sigh, unlock the door, say something awkward about paperwork or confusion. Instead, he rested his arm against the doorframe, blocking the entrance. "You can't come in," he said. The words didn't land right away. They hovered between us, unreal. "I just need to grab a few things," I replied. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. "I'll be quick." He shook his head once. No hesitation. "This isn't your house anymore." There was. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just delivered like a fact he'd been waiting to state. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I'd spent years learning how to keep my face still. In meetings. In arguments. In moments when reacting would cost more than silence. "I lived here," I said quietly. He shrugged. "You did." The past tense hit harder than the lock ever could. Behind him, I could see the hallway. The framed wedding photo still hung on the wall, my wife laughing, her hand gripping mine like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. I wondered if he'd noticed it was crooked, or if he'd stopped seeing it altogether. "The will is clear," he continued. "Everything goes through me now." I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment. This wasn't grief talking. This was timing. He'd waited. Waited until the funeral was over. Until the casseroles stopped arriving. Until the last person stopped checking in. Then he changed the locks. I thought about arguing. Thought about reminding him who paid the mortgage when he was still trying to figure out his life. Who covered tuition gaps. Who stayed quiet when he was rude, distant, dismissive. But I didn't say any of it. Because I saw it in his eyes. He wanted me to fight. He wanted me emotional. Desperate. So I did the one thing he didn't expect. I stepped back. "Okay," I said. That word confused him more than any insult ever could. "Okay," he repeated. "I'll go," I said. "I just need the folder from the study." He hesitated. Just long enough for me to notice. Then he disappeared inside and returned with a thin manila folder. "I already packed it," he said, holding it out like an offering. Or a trophy. I took it from his hand. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His were warm. Steady. Mine didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. "That's it," he said. "You should probably leave the keys." I reached into my pocket and placed them gently into his palm. Not tossed. Not slammed. Gently. That part mattered to me. He closed the door without another word. The click of the chain echoed louder than it should have. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door like it might change its mind. Like it might remember me. It didn't. I picked up the box at my feet and walked down the porch steps. No one stopped me. The neighbors' houses looked the same. Lawns trimmed. Cars parked. Life continuing at a pace that suddenly felt offensive. I placed the box in my car and sat behind the wheel without starting it. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I noticed they were shaking. Not from anger. From restraint. Grief had already taken my wife. I wasn't about to let it take my dignity too. I looked down at the folder on the passenger seat. My name was written on the tab in my wife's handwriting. Careful. Familiar. I hadn't opened it yet. Some part of me was afraid. Afraid it would confirm what my stepson clearly believed, that I had been a placeholder. A temporary figure in a story that was never really mine. I started the car. As I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of the living room window. For a second, I thought I saw movement. Then nothing. The house stood still. I drove without a destination. Past streets I knew. Past places that held versions of me I wasn't sure existed anymore. By the time I stopped, the sun was setting. I sat in the parking lot of a motel I'd never noticed before. One of those places you don't see until you need it. I turned off the engine. For the first time since the funeral, I let myself breathe. Not cry. Just breathe. I picked up the folder and ran my thumb along its edge. Whatever was inside it, one thing was already clear. He thought grief had made me weak. He thought silence meant surrender. And he thought the story was already over. I hadn't even opened the first page yet. I checked into a small, almost invisible motel, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and didn't notice when someone disappeared into a room. The flickering neon sign hummed softly, like it was in on the secret that my life had just been rewritten without my consent. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the cardboard box slide from my lap to the floor. The weight of it was nothing compared to the emptiness that had settled in me. I hadn't cried, not yet, but I felt the tight coil of disbelief unwind slowly in my chest. How does a man come home and find himself erased, not by death, but by those who think they hold the right to decide what belongs to him? I opened the folder on the bed. Papers, neatly arranged, some with my wife's precise handwriting. Bills, insurance policies, deeds, a few investment statements I hadn't thought about in years. Everything that mattered. Everything that she had quietly protected. And something more. Something I hadn't expected. I ran my hands over the documents, letting the reality sink in. The house, the furniture, the accounts. He had no idea of the trust structures, the careful planning, the unseen lines that kept things secure. My stepson had thought he had won. But this was only the first chapter of his mistake. I had survived this long by observing, by thinking ahead, by holding my cards close. I had learned, painfully, that silence could be more powerful than anger. I made a call to my lawyer. The number was on speed dial, stored for emergencies I hoped would never come. He answered on the first ring. "You didn't lose everything," he said. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made me lean forward in the chair, gripping the folder. "You just stopped looking." I laughed quietly, bitterly. Stopped looking? Or stopped being allowed to? "Sometimes, that's exactly the same thing," he replied. "But the paperwork, the assets, the will, they're still yours. You just have to play the game your stepson thinks he's already won." The words were both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because there was a way forward. Infuriating because he had been counting on me to be weak, distracted, broken. My wife had trusted me with more than love. She had trusted me with her foresight, her planning. I had almost forgotten the strength in that. Almost. I hung up and sat in silence, staring at the ceiling. The neon light flickered against the peeling paint, casting long shadows across the room. I thought about the mornings when I had made coffee for my wife, the evenings spent planning the life we thought we were building. All those small, unnoticed acts, they weren't nothing. They were everything. The thought of my stepson, confident and smug, made my jaw tighten. But I did not rage. I did not call him names. I did not threaten. I simply reminded myself of the one rule I had learned too late in my youth: control your response or it will control you. I flipped through the folder again, this time more carefully. noting accounts, statements, letters. My wife had been meticulous. Every asset, every contingency, every plan for the unexpected, everything he assumed was lost was preserved. I felt a flicker of something long dormant, anticipation. Not joy, not revenge, but the clarity that comes from knowing the foundation beneath your feet is solid. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed. Streetlights buzzed. Life continued. But for the first time in hours, I felt the stirrings of calm. Not because I had gained anything yet, but because I had not lost myself. Not really. Not completely. I took out a pen and began scribbling notes, mapping out the steps I would take. Legal strategies, timing, the order in which I would reveal what was already mine. Each line felt like reclaiming a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Sleep eventually claimed me in small doses. Not restful, but enough for my mind to continue plotting, imagining, calculating. The folder stayed beside me, a silent promise that tomorrow was not for him to dictate. I woke before dawn, the first light seeping through the thin curtains. The world was quiet again, but now it felt like a stage. And I was not a spectator. I was a participant. I was ready. I looked at the folder once more. Whatever game had been set, whatever assumptions had been made, it was now my move. And this time, I would not be underestimated. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, walking into the room, head held high, heart pounding with a mix of grief and resolve. But nothing in my imagination had prepared me for the weight of reality. The room was larger than I expected, a mix of polished wood and leather chairs, solemn faces, and the subtle scent of expensive cologne. Everyone seemed to know the script. My stepson, seated at the center, exuded the confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. His smile was sharp, rehearsed, and it landed on me like a punch. The attorney cleared his throat, shuffling papers with meticulous care. "We are here to read the last will and testament of your wife." I felt the room shrink. My chest tightened. Memories flooded me, morning coffee, late-night talks, the small, steady presence that had held our family together. And now, in a single breath, I was to face everyone who assumed I had no place here. The attorney began with the standard formalities. Assets distributed, minor bequests, sentimental items, the predictable roll call. My stepson's smirk grew with each name that was not mine. I stayed quiet, letting him think this was my silence breaking me. But inside, every fiber of me was alert, every detail catalogued. "Now," the attorney said, pausing, "there is one final section." The words hung in the air. He glanced at me briefly, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of acknowledgement, not sympathy, but recognition. Based on the trust and disclosed assets, the attorney continued, the net worth assigned to the surviving spouse exceeds $12 million. A pin dropped somewhere, though the silence was deafening. The stepson's confident posture faltered. His fingers, previously interlaced with smug assurance, loosened. The air seemed to thicken, charged with disbelief. I remained still, letting the information settle. Not triumphant, not smug, just quiet, controlled. He had expected desperation. He had expected rage or pleading. Instead, there was only a calm that cut deeper than any argument. Somewhere in the room, I thought I heard the faint gasp of a bystander. A chair scraped back. The stepson's eyes widened, disbelief painted across his face. He had calculated every step, believed he had the ending written. And yet, here it was, proof that he had underestimated the unseen, the quiet planning, the years of silent preparation that I had inherited from my wife's foresight. I felt a strange sense of detachment. This was not the moment for vengeance. This was the moment for recognition. Recognition that I had been present all along, that silence and patience had preserved more than he could ever imagine. A colleague of mine once told me, the loudest man in the room rarely wins. Today, that lesson proved true. The stepson had the noise, the smirk, the performance, but he lacked the foundation. I let the attorney continue, letting the procedural rhythm carry the rest of the reading. Names, places, minor gifts, everything else became background noise. I observed the room, noting reactions, noticing the subtle shifts in alliances, the twitch of uncertainty in the eyes that had previously looked at me with doubt. After the reading, murmurs filled the room. Some congratulated, some whispered, some simply stared. The stepson remained rooted, the confidence draining slowly, replaced by confusion and, perhaps, fear. His body language betrayed him now. A slight slump in the shoulders, a tightening of the jaw, a sharp inhale as if trying to regain composure. I stood when it was over. Not to gloat, not to assert dominance. I stood because I existed, because I mattered, because I had been invisible long enough to everyone who had assumed otherwise. My footsteps were deliberate, echoing softly against the polished floor as I approached the exit. Each step a reminder that control and dignity were mine to reclaim. Outside, the air was cooler, lighter, carrying away the suffocating tension of the room. I inhaled deeply, letting the reality settle. I had not only survived this confrontation, I had preserved myself, my integrity, and the quiet strength that my wife had trusted me with. The folder still rested in my mind's eye. What it contained was more than paper and numbers. It was proof, legacy, security. But it was also a reminder: patience, discretion, and calculated restraint often outweigh the theatrics of arrogance. As I walked to the car, I could see my stepson in the rearview mirror, his expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had thought he held the power, the victory, the narrative. And yet, he had been blindsided by something he never considered: the invisible work, the quiet planning, the depth of preparation. I slid into the driver's seat and exhaled slowly. No celebration. No triumph. Just awareness. Just acknowledgement that the next moves were mine, and mine alone. Tomorrow, the real strategy would begin. Today was the proof of concept. Silence and patience had rewritten the assumptions of everyone in that room. And that, I realized, was worth more than any immediate victory. I drove home after the will reading, though the word home felt strange in my mouth. The streets were familiar, but every house I passed reminded me that life moves on, indifferent to grief, indifferent to injustice. I had been written out of one story, yet another was quietly waiting for me, one I had never fully claimed. I parked at a quiet spot and retrieved the folder from the passenger seat. I hadn't looked inside since the motel the night before, and yet I knew that it held the truth. The truth of what had been preserved, quietly, meticulously, beyond the sight of my stepson or anyone else who assumed they could erase me. Inside, the documents were as precise and methodical as my wife had always been. Trusts, investments, deeds, lines drawn to protect, to safeguard, to anticipate the unexpected. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed power or wealth. Everything hidden, silent, waiting for the right moment. I realized then that my wife had understood me in ways even I hadn't. She had trusted me not just with love, but with foresight, planning, and discretion. She had built shields around our life, knowing that there might come a day when I would need them, when others might assume I was powerless. And today, she had been right. I ran my hands over the pages, letting the calm, calculated order of them sink in. My stepson had been confident, arrogant even, believing that what is visible is all that matters. He had been counting on my silence, my grief, my assumed weakness. He had not accounted for the unseen, the quiet, the patient planning that had been unfolding under his nose for years. A wave of clarity passed over me. This was not revenge, not yet. This was recognition. Recognition of the strength that comes from being underestimated, from understanding that patience and discretion often carry more weight than noise and arrogance. I recalled conversations with my wife, snippets of advice embedded in ordinary moments. "You don't have to fight every battle," she'd said. "Choose the ones that matter. Protect what counts." I had taken those words to heart, often silently, storing them as a blueprint for times when everything else failed. Tonight, in the quiet of my car parked on a nondescript street, I finally understood the depth of what she had entrusted to me. The net worth revealed in court was more than numbers. It was a testament to foresight, to patience, to the invisible work that often goes unnoticed but never wasted. I made notes, charting possibilities, outlining strategies. Every account, every legal provision, every piece of documentation became a tool, a lever. I was no longer a man reacting to circumstance, I was a man preparing to act. The city hummed around me, unaware of the recalibration taking place inside a quiet sedan. Somewhere, a car horn blared. A pedestrian laughed. Life continued, unbothered by the quiet power accumulating in my hands. And yet, I felt a steady thrill, not of greed, not of vengeance, but of clarity, control, and readiness. I took a deep breath, letting the night settle around me. I understood now that I had always had more than I realized. More security, more foresight, more influence than anyone had accounted for. My stepson's assumptions had been built on appearances, on arrogance, on the noise of youth. He had not understood the strength that grows in silence. I closed the folder gently, almost reverently. It was more than just paper. It was trust, legacy, and proof that I had never been powerless. I had simply never claimed it, until now. I leaned back in the seat, letting the weight of this realization sink in. My stepson thought he had written the ending. But endings are never as simple as they appear. And this story, this life, had chapters that were still mine to author. The hours stretched long and quiet, almost unbearably so. I found myself sitting in the same motel room, the folder beside me like a silent ally, as if it could absorb the tension in the air and keep me steady. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't scroll through my phone. Nothing could distract from the gravity of the days ahead. Outside, life continued, oblivious. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked. Cars moved past, lights reflecting off the damp asphalt from a recent rain. And yet inside, time felt suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way I would move. I poured a cup of coffee, black, bitter, grounding. The mug warmed my hands, and I allowed myself a slow exhale. Patience, I reminded myself. Let the others act. Let them miscalculate. I had learned, painfully, that a man's power often lies in restraint, in the ability to wait while others hurry toward their own assumptions. My stepson's face hovered in my mind, the smug expression he had worn during the will reading now tainted by uncertainty. He didn't know it yet, but the real challenge hadn't even begun. Every misstep, every premature display of confidence on his part, had only strengthened my position. He had spoken loudly, I had observed quietly. He had believed victory was his, I had preserved the means to reclaim it. I went over the notes I had made, the accounts, the legal documents, the contingencies my wife had carefully put into place. I reviewed strategies, weighing patience against action, observation against confrontation. Each consideration sharpened my resolve. Each possibility reminded me that I had options that my stepson could not even fathom. Hours passed. The room grew dimmer as the sun sank lower outside the window. I felt the weight of silence pressing against me, but I welcomed it. In that quiet, I had clarity. I could think, plan, and understand the scope of the situation without interruption. Every detail became sharper, every strategy more precise. I remembered advice from an old mentor, whispered in the confines of a career long ago. The longest silence, he had said, is sometimes the loudest message. I had scoffed then, but now I understood. Silence could be an act of power. Silence could make others reveal their weaknesses. Silence could build a foundation beneath the assumptions of arrogance. A knock on the door startled me, momentarily breaking the quiet. I didn't move immediately. It came again, softer, deliberate. I opened the door cautiously. A delivery man stood there, holding a small package addressed to me. I signed for it without speaking, noting the curious look he gave me, as though sensing the tension I carried without needing to ask. Inside, the package held nothing more than a single note in my wife's handwriting, preserved and passed along by our attorney. Trust what you know, not what they believe. I smiled faintly, the weight in my chest easing just slightly. She had anticipated this long ago. The guidance was simple, but it was enough. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the room bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights outside. I sat back, folder on my lap, sipping the now cold coffee. The night was still. The silence was deep. And yet, in that quiet, I felt the stirring of resolve stronger than any anger or impatience could produce. Tomorrow, I thought, would bring new challenges. The stepson would act, assuming he still held control. But I would be ready. Today had been a rehearsal of patience. Today had been the longest silence I had ever endured. And it had not been wasted. I leaned back in the chair, eyes tracing the ceiling, mind racing yet steady. The folder, the documents, the careful preparation. It all reminded me of one truth. Being underestimated is a gift, and silence, when wielded correctly, can speak louder than any outburst. As I finally closed my eyes, I felt a strange calm, the sort that only comes from knowing that while others rush to make noise, the patient man quietly moves the pieces that will ultimately define the outcome. The longest silence was mine, and soon it would be time to let the next move unfold. The morning air felt sharp as I approached the house, the folder resting under my arm like a shield. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. Every step was deliberate, measured, a silent declaration that I was no longer the man who walked away without resistance. Today, I would step into the narrative that my stepson had assumed belonged to him. I paused at the porch, feeling the familiar weight of keys that were no longer mine. I didn't knock. I didn't call. The door was answered by him, his face frozen between surprise and smug expectation. "Back so soon?" he said, attempting lightness that did not reach his eyes. "I'm here to settle some unfinished business," I replied, calm, voice steady, every word deliberate. He laughed nervously. "Unfinished business? You got nothing, remember?" I let his words hang in the air. Silence can be sharper than any insult, and I intended to wield it. He gestured for me to enter, but I remained on the porch, observing. The house looked the same, lived in and familiar, yet alien. Every detail, the framed wedding photos, the furniture, the quiet order, was a reminder of what he didn't understand. Control is not always loud, and ownership is not always visible. "I don't think you understand," I said, finally, opening the folder and letting it spill just enough for him to see the edges of documents, statements, and legal records. "Everything he assumes he owns, it isn't yours. Not legally. Not practically. Not without me." His smile faltered. He stepped closer, trying to mask uncertainty with bravado. "You mean the house? The accounts? You don't even live here anymore." I met his gaze evenly. "I don't need to. My wife planned everything knowing someone might try to rush the story, assuming silence was weakness. It wasn't. And it isn't." He shifted, suddenly aware of the miscalculation he had made, the assumption that grief equaled surrender. His fingers tightened on a door frame, knuckles white, but he said nothing. Words would not help him here. I continued, unfolding the folder to reveal specific accounts, trust structures, and contingencies that had been invisible to him. "This," I said, letting the folder slide slightly into view, "is proof. Proof that patience and discretion outweigh arrogance and haste. You thought this was your victory, but it was only a misconception of power." For a moment, he said nothing. Just stared, realizing that the quiet man he had dismissed was fully aware, fully prepared, and fully unshakable. "I don't understand," he muttered finally, the edge in his voice betraying fear and frustration. "Then you should listen carefully," I replied. "Not everything that glitters is yours, and not every silence is weakness. Some of it is strategy. Some of it is survival. And some of it is respect, something I've offered where it wasn't expected." The room seemed to hold its breath. I had made my position clear without raising my voice, without confrontation beyond necessary words. The weight of truth hung between us like an invisible barrier, one that his confidence could not breach. He finally stepped back, nodding slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the power shift that had taken place. The arrogance that had filled the space before was gone, replaced by uncertainty and calculation. He had assumed he could dictate the story, and now he understood that the author had never left. I folded the folder, tucking it under my arm once more. "This isn't over," I said softly. "But let this be a lesson. Assumptions about silence, grief, or weakness are dangerous. Always respect the unseen forces at play. Always. He swallowed, nodded again, and for the first time, I saw hesitation, not just in his body, but in his mindset. He had misjudged the quiet man. And that misjudgment would guide every next move. I turned to leave, every step measured, every breath controlled. I wasn't here to humiliate, to gloat, or to exact revenge. I was here to reclaim presence, authority, and truth. And in that calm, deliberate action, I realized something crucial. Power is quiet, patient, and calculated. It doesn't always need to shout to be recognized. The folder was heavy, but the weight felt good in my hands. It was tangible proof that I had survived, that I had planned, and that I could act decisively when the moment arrived. I left the house not with anger, but with a quiet sense of control, knowing that the next moves were mine to orchestrate, and the story, as I always had, would be written on my terms. The morning felt different, charged with a quiet intensity. I could feel it in my chest, a low hum of anticipation mixed with clarity. Days of silence, reflection, and preparation had led to this moment. Today was not about confrontation, it was about action, about translating patience into decisive movement. The folder rested on the passenger seat of my car, a tangible reminder that I held both proof and power. I arrived at the office where the estate attorney had suggested a meeting with all relevant parties. The room was stark, professional, and deliberate, every chair, table, and legal form a subtle reminder that the world operates on rules, not assumptions. I was here to bend those rules to the narrative my stepson had assumed he controlled. He arrived first, smug confidence in every step. He saw me and smiled, the same rehearsed expression that had failed him in the will reading. I didn't return the smile. Instead, I offered a nod that was polite yet authoritative, enough to unsettle him subtly. "Glad you could make it," he said, voice strained with unearned certainty. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly. My tone calm, measured, deliberate. The attorney began the meeting, laying out the agenda and procedural expectations. I listened, absorbing every word, watching every reaction. My stepson tried to assert dominance early, questioning minor procedural points, attempting to control the narrative. I let him speak. The longer he rambled, the more his miscalculations became evident. The room itself seemed to tighten around his misplaced confidence. Finally, I opened the folder, spreading the documents across the table. Every statement, every trust account, every legal contingency lay bare before us. "Let's review this carefully," I said, my voice steady. "These are the facts, not assumptions." He looked, his eyes widening as he began to grasp the depth of planning and foresight he had overlooked. "I don't understand," he stammered, a tremor in his voice betraying disbelief. "Then listen closely," I said. "You believed the narrative belonged to you, that silence was weakness, that grief was a void you could exploit. But the truth is different. Everything you assumed was yours was either preserved, protected, or planned for precisely this moment." The attorney nodded slightly, acknowledging the precision of my statements and the clarity of the documentation. The room, once tense with expectation, now held a quiet respect, subtle but unmistakable. I watched my stepson struggle internally. Each fact I presented, each legal nuance, chipped away at his confidence. His attempts to counter, to question, only revealed the gap between his assumptions and the reality. He had misjudged both my patience and my knowledge. "Every move you make," I continued, "should be measured. Hasty actions now will only highlight inexperience. Observe, reflect, and act with awareness. That is how power endures." He swallowed, finally meeting my gaze. There was no more arrogance, no smug performance. Just awareness, recognition, and, I suspected, a dawning fear of what he had underestimated. I folded the folder carefully, the weight in my hands a reminder of both what had been entrusted to me and what I had earned through patience and restraint. "The story isn't over," I said quietly. "But now, it's clear who holds the advantage." Leaving the office, I felt a shift, not external, but internal. The stepson would act, yes, but the foundation was mine. Strategy, preparation, foresight. These were the tools that no arrogance could displace. And for the first time in days, I felt the exhilaration of control without needing to prove dominance through noise or theatrics. The day was not yet over. Challenges remained. Decisions would need to be made. But this turning point was undeniable. The quiet, patient man had revealed his hand at the precise moment, and the balance had shifted irrevocably. I walked to my car, folder tucked under my arm, steps deliberate, measured. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the city streets. In that quiet, I felt the weight of what had been achieved and the promise of what was still to come. Today was the turning point, and tomorrow, the next chapter would unfold on my terms. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered, the air thick with anticipation and the quiet hum of whispered expectations. This was the final act, the culmination of patience, preparation, and observation. I held the folder close, a symbol of the strategy and foresight that had carried me here. Today was not about revenge. Today was about truth, clarity, and reclaiming what was always rightfully mine. I walked in steadily, meeting eyes, acknowledging the murmurs without a word. My stepson looked for smugness, for weakness, for any sign that the past weeks had unsettled me. He found none. My silence, once mistaken for submission, now radiated authority. The attorney cleared his throat, a signal that the proceedings were about to begin. "We are ready to finalize the estate distribution," he said. The room held its breath. Every face was waiting for a reaction, for drama, for the predictable collapse of grief and disbelief. But I offered none. I was calm, composed, present. The reading proceeded as expected at first. Minor bequests, ceremonial acknowledgments, and acknowledgments of assets distributed. Then the attorney paused, looking toward me with a subtle nod. "There is one final provision," he said. "Based on the trust and disclosed assets, the surviving spouse's net worth exceeds $12 million. The room seemed to exhale collectively. My stepson's confident posture crumbled. His eyes widened, disbelief replacing the smug assurance that had carried him through previous weeks. A murmur swept through the audience. The hush that followed was heavy, almost tangible, as though the walls themselves held their breath. I felt the weight of every previous day settle within me. The quiet nights, the meticulous planning, the strategic patience, all led to this moment. I had not yelled, pleaded, or demanded. I had observed. I had prepared. And now, the truth of foresight and quiet strength revealed itself with clarity. Somewhere in the courtroom, I thought I heard the faintest gasp. A chair scraped back. The stepson's face was a mask of shock, as if the world he had assumed under his control had shifted in an instant. He had calculated everything, yet he had failed to account for the invisible layers, the trust, the foresight, the patient strength that had guided every move I made. I allowed myself a measured exhale, subtle, controlled. This was not triumph for vanity, but recognition of endurance and presence. I had survived loss, betrayal, and assumption. I had preserved what mattered, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the narrative that had once seemed to belong entirely to another. The attorney continued with formalities, but I barely noticed the procedural rhythm. My focus remained internal, reflecting on the journey, the grief, the silence, the observation, and the patient assertion of control. Each element had built to this quiet apex, where the unseen work spoke louder than words, louder than performance, louder than arrogance. When the reading concluded, whispers filled the room. Eyes that once doubted now acknowledged, subtly, the quiet power of restraint and preparation. The stepson sat frozen, understanding at last that he had misjudged not only me but the depth of the strategy that had always been in place. I stood slowly, not to gloat, but to exist fully in the moment. Each step toward the exit was deliberate, carrying the weight of authority, of clarity, of victory not measured in noise but in truth. The courtroom, the participants, the murmurs, all fell away into the periphery. What mattered was simple. I had reclaimed presence, power, and peace of mind. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying away the tension and leaving a sense of quiet resolution. The folder rested in my hand, but more than that, The weight of the journey itself rested in my chest. I had faced loss, endured betrayal, and navigated the intricate dance of patience and strategy. And now I was whole again, not because of what had been given, but because of what I had preserved and claimed. I looked at the city streets, familiar yet different, and understood that life would continue indifferent, but now under a quiet, unshakable authority that was mine. The stepson would act, people would speculate, but I had learned a lesson more enduring than any court decision: the strength of silence, the power of patience, and the clarity of calculated action are forces that cannot be erased. As I walked away, folder secure, heart steady, I realized the story had not only ended but had transformed. I had been underestimated. I had been tested. And in the end, I had not only survived but emerged with clarity, empowerment, and quiet triumph. The resolution was complete, not loud, not boastful, but absolute.